You're listening to The Opportunity.
Hi, my name is Adam Grant and I'm the Director of Communications at the Superpower Institute. Today on The Opportunity, we're featuring an edited audio version of a recent presentation and conversation with Kos Samaras, titled Why We Shouldn't Be Held Hostage to the Past, Unlocking the Consensus on Pricing Pollution. Kos is the Director of Strategy and Analytics at Redbridge Group. In this conversation, he walks us through what he's seeing in the electorate, based partly on polling commissioned by the Superpower Institute in support of our latest report, The Case for Pricing Pollution. Kos explains how the Australian voter base has fundamentally changed and what that means for the politics of climate and economic reform. A bit of background on the Pricing Pollution report. It argues for two linked reforms. The first is the Polluter Pays Levy, an upstream levy on fossil fuels extracted or imported for domestic use. It's designed to cover about 80% of Australia's emissions. It would generate significant public revenue, enabling direct support and compensation for households and small businesses, while also strengthening the budget and funding essential services such as health, education and defence. The second is the Fair Share Levy, a Norway-style approach to securing a fairer return from the sale of Australia's gas resources. Like the PPL, it generates significant public revenue without impacting on jobs, investment or energy prices. Alongside this policy work, we asked Redbridge to test attitudes towards cost of living, climate and economic reform across the Australian electorate, to probe the popularity of the principles underpinning these two reforms and to examine their political viability. A quick note before we begin, some of Kos's presentations refers to detailed polling results and slides, which you can find in full on the Superpower Institute website. Here's Kos Samaras.
So what I want to talk about today is obviously the findings from the research, but also the overall sentiment that we're picking up across the Australian community with regards to policies like the ones that have been advocated and just been presented, but also the changing nature of the political landscape in this country. We just touched on before about the carbon tax, for example. The last time it was a political issue, it's very important for us to acknowledge that the electoral roll looked vastly different. Baby boom population back then was in excess of 60% of all those enrolled in this country. They are now into the 20s. And that means a lot because I'm about to talk to you about why younger Australians are reshaping the political landscape as we see it. There are two very significant undercurrents at the moment that are pulling what I will describe the centre to the extremities. We have an economic populist constituency, which largely now supports the Labor and Green and other left-wing minor parties, and is unlikely to move over the river and start voting Conservative. So very, very tribal traits. We have tested this extensively and know that there is a certain group now that just won't switch. Very different to, as I touched on before, within 20 years ago, where the baby boom generation would, in certain significant numbers, actually switch between right and left, depending on the mood and depending on the state of the economy and so on. So this economic populist cohort is largely made up of Generation Z, Millennial, and to a certain extent, Gen X and some baby boomers, but they're in much smaller numbers. Flip side, the right-wing populist movement, which we are now seeing writ large in all the polling, and obviously the numbers that we are seeing around One Nation across all polling companies, this is probably the biggest shift that we are witnessing, and they are driven by very different agendas to what I would say old Conservative constituencies were animated by. They are rejecting elite agendas as they would report to us. They're suspicious of climate policy, but we'll get to that in a minute as to why there is a difference here. And they're largely made up of older Australians. So it's usually Gen X and young baby boomers. And there's to a certain extent people in the late 40s as well. Stating the obvious, climate policy in this country is divided and is divided between urban and regional Australia. You find stronger levels of support for climate action within our large cities, and obviously that drops off in support as we head into the regions. The same can be applied when we are talking about the age difference. So younger Australians, Generation Z, for example, far more likely to be in support of strong action on climate versus baby boomers, which express the lower levels of support. And again, the political split between that sentiment between Labor and Green voters versus Coalition and One Nation voters is clearly evident. However, this is all about how you frame it. And this is why I think the right-wing populist movement that we are seeing now grow in this country is driven by other factors than what I think some conservative commentators in this country, and I would say those in the Liberal Party, think they're being driven by. The minute you change it from a climate narrative to one of fairness, that changes. So, asking the question, Australians deserve a better return from the sale of our natural resources like our coal and gas exports, there's the numbers. And this is right across the country. It's universal. It cuts across both political divides, and it's profoundly a seismic shift in sentiment when you reframe climate policy in this way. So if we move from the abstract climate action to concrete, who's paying for it and who should be paying for it, it should surprise no one that right-wing populists who distrust institutions, no longer support large companies, are wanting to see that those institutions pay their fair share. And this is probably the most significant shift in sentiment, especially when you reframe it in this way. So again, I do mention there that we are looking at the depth of the carbon tax political world, so to speak, especially when you talk about the Australian government should introduce a pollution levy on the country's 100 biggest polluting companies who collectively make up 80% of Australia's emissions to pay for greenhouse gases they emit. Even amongst One Nation voters, 41% agree with that sentiment. So yes, not all of them do, but you can see there that 2/3 of voters are in support of it. Obviously, it largely skews to the bigger cities, but also in regional Australia. Net positive rating of 22 amongst the existing coalition voters, that is, those that are left. And this is important because whatever's left on the coalition's poll right now, and it varies between 16 and 19%, those coalition MPs have to be very, very careful, because you could see here that what's remaining on their pile is probably more animated about this policy area and these types of policies than what has left them. So those individuals that are left them for One Nation, for example, are more likely to fight to bite down hard on the narrative around we must reject the politics of climate action, viewing it as a left-wing thing rather than anything else. And again, there's a gender divide here, and that gender divide is stark, particularly within the coalition and the One Nation vote. So the coalition vote, it's in excess of 75%. But more broadly speaking, again, women 58% versus 62% in the big cities, and obviously men, there is still a strong level of support, but it drops off a bit. And again, as I touched on before, it should surprise no one that the younger the constituency, the more likely they're going to be supporting this proposition. And obviously baby boomers, although still in the positive space, are very much in favour of it. And of course, One Nation, as I mentioned, still 41% agree with this proposal and this sentiment. So if framed in a certain way, and if particular sectors or other organisations start campaigning on this narrative, it will gain significant traction and support within the community. Then we ask them, okay, so where do you want the money to go? And of course, there's strong sentiment across all constituencies and voting cohorts that it should be reinvested into Australia. So obviously, infrastructure, relieving bill shock, building affordable housing, and investing, and more importantly, investing in renewable energy and clean manufacturing. So again, Australians have got a fairly good, I would say, view about where those sort of taxes should be spent, and they have a view that if you are extracting resources from this country, you should at least be reinvesting it. And it probably goes to the point that I've made to the resource sector myself, and that is the social license work that should have been done has not been done. There's a strong view across as I said, these two polarizing movements that are pulling the country apart, that the big end of town has not contributed to this country in the way that they themselves are personally required to do in terms of their own taxes. So there is a lot of work to be done by the resource sector to ensure that they are not caught in a political pincer. Because sooner or later, having commented on politics now for a long time, we are now moving into an unprecedented political environment, which I think the political class is absolutely ill-equipped to manage. And we could see knee-jerk responses to pressures from particular constituencies. That said, this also provides an opportunity for these sort of policies as well. And that's all present and available to people to run these sort of campaigns because, as I touched on, the social license work has not been done, and the investment back into the community clearly is not present, or more importantly, if it is occurring, the Australian public's not aware of it. So the 5 key takeaways on this is that when the narrative leads with fairness, not climate, the resource fairness frame harvests massive amount of support. As you can see there, it's 82% net agree. It massively outperforms the climate action frame. And this is the point I would make to sectors that are operating in this space, that it's more important to actually frame policy initiatives through the fairness lens rather than through technical jargon. And it's more important to illustrate why large resource companies need to reinvest into Australia. And even if you're talking about tax, instead of saying it's a tax, say we're asking them to reinvest into Australians' roads, infrastructure, help them with their bills, and so on and so on. Obviously, pollution as a word has a very different stimuli than other frames that have been used, such as emissions. Pollution clearly triggers a particular psychological response in voters out there, and it captures their imagination in ways that usual jargon does not. And hence, when you reframe it as a pollution levy rather than a carbon tax, you are getting very different responses from the public. We did through the research, did ask, and we did illustrate to Australians that we spoke to about Norway as a benchmark that many people are aware of, some of those Scandinavian countries' policy settings, and do point to them as really good examples of what happens when government and corporates work together to reinvest into their communities, and they do have a view that this country has not done enough in that space. So, net agreement that Australia deserves a better return from resource exports. This is a sentiment we're picking up across all our research. It's obviously very prevalent here in this country, but there's a very strong view, and you could see the results there. One Nation voters, Labor voters, coalition voters, all voters in regional Australia, and I only listed regional because you can just imagine what the numbers are like in big cities. The numbers are off the charts. Normally, you get a net positive rating of about 10 or 15%, and you think that's a great result. This is significant. In other words, it's hard for us to find anyone that we surveyed that didn't agree with this proposal. And this is where I think that the resource sector has got a lot of vulnerability. It has to face a particular political challenge because it's created an environment where they are now vulnerable to the politics of fairness. And the only way I think that going forward that they can get around this is if there is a counter to what they're doing right now, and that is they need to start thinking long and hard about how they are reinvesting in the country's future. And of course, hence people bite down pretty hard on a pollution levy, making people pay their fair share, reinvesting into Australia.
Next, the Superpower Institute's CEO, Bathan Mullen, joined the conversation to lead an audience Q&A. Bathan began by observing that, according to the Redbridge polls, climate action clearly divides opinion, and yet outright opposition appears limited. He asks, how should we understand the political significance of this difference, and which parts of the electorate will actually determine the outcome of the next election?
Yeah, so if we look at our political landscape, you can't win elections unless you're winning the politics of Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and the big cities. And we see that writ large at the recent federal election last year in May, where The coalition basically was busted down to 8 urban seats out of 88. It's lost, to give you some contrast, it's lost of the last 8 leaders, as in Liberal Party leaders, and obviously prime ministers and opposition leaders and so on. 7 of the 8 have been lost. The only seat that's left is Cook. The rest have been lost to independents and to the Labor Party. So we're talking about seats like Bennelong, Menzies, and these are, significant seats that once upon a time were viewed by the coalition as safe, liberal, conservative seats. They are now overwhelmingly populated by younger professionals who historically probably would have voted for the version of the Liberal Party in the 90s or even 80s. But given the trajectory they've been moving and they've been animated by the National Party, National Party politics, it should surprise no one that they are largely now become a regional rural political movement along with their coalition partners, the National Party. Animating these urban environments are obviously diverse Australians, but overwhelmingly, as I touched on, Generation Z and millennials. They are behaving politically drastically different to older Australians. There is now enough data out there, including the Australian electoral study conducted by the ANU, to illustrate that millennials are not becoming more conservative as they're aging. The only difference we're seeing is the millennials who were voting for the coalition now voting for One Nation. That's the difference, right? That's the big shift. And the two-party preferred vote for Labor amongst Gen Z and millennial is in excess of 60%. Gen Z's even higher. And to give you some more, I'll say more of an insight into why these younger generations matter, 2 points. The Green vote amongst Generation Z women across the entire country, it doesn't matter where we look, is 45%. And then combined, those two generations are going to be close to 50% of the electoral come the next election. So if you're not winning the politics in the hearts and minds of these particular Australians, you're not winning any election or getting anywhere close to any seats in the big cities.
And finally, from me, one of your most striking findings, I think, was when the question is reframed from one of climate action to one about who pays.
Yes.
We see quite different results, and that's I think a very telling finding here, and perhaps explains why we see some patterns here that we don't typically expect. But from your point of view, how is it that across polar opposite ends of the political spectrum, we see almost united views on who should pay for the damage to the environment?
When we talk to One Nation voters now, that is One Nation voters, largely Gen X, but young baby boomers as well, who were former coalition voters and now supporting One Nation. They are largely living in the regions, but also in the outer suburbs, but predominantly in the regions and regional cities and so on. They usually don't have a university degree. They work with trades. They work on their feet. They work with their hands. It's those sort of occupations. They perceive that their living standards have been on the decline now for 2 decades. They were basically Howard's battlers. So they were in their 30s and 40s when John Howard was around, and now very much middle age, and have a sense that the political establishment has abandoned them. They blame the coalition for that, obviously, because they are Liberal voters or National Party voters. And at the epicenter, when we say, well, why do you think the Liberal Party or the National Party has abandoned you? They say, well, because they only care about the big end of town. And that big end of town is in the business of fleecing me. My energy bills, my health systems is screwed. If one of my family members get cancer, it involves a 6-hour drive to get treatment because, of course, they're all private hospitals and those investments are no good in the country. So they're just throwing all the money in the big cities. They can talk to you for hours about this. So hence, when you flip it to fairness and say, well, those big companies should be paying tax, or at the very least, they should be reinvesting into your community, they bite down really hard on this because they are animated by similar things. But the difference between that cohort and there's an economic younger populist cohort is that cohort is also animated by cultural issues such as race, identity, status anxiety, all of that.
Thanks, Kos. We're going to go to questions from the audience now. We've got some great questions coming through. There's a there's a couple of people who've asked a variation on a similar question, so I'll try and roll it all into one. But there's a view that polling like this is a sort of static snapshot of a moment in time, and in reality, what we will see is if a government ever decided to adopt these policies, really active campaigns against these policies by various stakeholders. And I think we all know that happened in the context of
Yes.
the carbon price in the early 2010s, and Tony Abbott was effective in winning an election around that. So what's your view about how robust these results are to campaigns that might be run in the near future? Have things changed in the electorate such that those campaigns would be less effective, or are we likely to see similar things again? And will we see the numbers you've presented today eroded in the context of a campaign?
So 2019 federal election was the last time Labor made an effort to win an election through roads that run through regional Australia. Once that election was lost, there was a robust discussion internally within Labor that they need to start pursuing emerging demographies which clearly are voting for them, and they have not been successful in capitalising on them. So in 2022, they won seats like Bennelong, Reid, Higgins in Melbourne. In 2025, they picked up Deakin and Menzies and a lot of other urban seats, and they've pulled away from the politics of regional Australia. The carbon tax campaign worked really well against Labor because, of course, Labor back then still relied on a very significant number of regional electorates, which may be animated by the politics of, well, if you tax this industry, you're going to lose your jobs. A really good example is that the Queensland state election, writ large, as a result, what I'm talking about, that state election, Labor largely held its own in Brisbane and lost all of its regional territories, particularly in the northern parts near Townsville and Rockhampton and so on. These are seats they've held for over 100 years, but they now appreciate as a political movement that their epicenter has moved to urban settings. Now that's probably going to be a problem for Queensland Labor, but not for Albanese, because all roads to victory lead through those big cities for him. So the possibility of a campaign against a pollution levy, a fairness levy, whatever you want to frame it, of that working, pretty remote. And the levels of distrust about the big end of town that we pick up as researchers, it's off the charts. This was not the mindset back in 2013. Very different. We are literally living in a new paradigm.
Thanks, Kos. Question from Damien Spruce, who says that on climate action, even when voters support it, as the numbers show, when you do an ordering of issues, ordering of priority, most people say climate change action isn't a top order issue.
Yes.
Rates somewhere in the middle, I think, in the ranking. So when it comes to conflict of climate action with other issues like economics or jobs or anything else that people think is important, what does that mean for the importance of the numbers you show, do you think?
Yeah, the power in what you're proposing as a policy change is that it actually touches on the issue of cost of living. So they have a view that they are being unfairly taxed and that the big end of town gets away with blue murder. They have a view that rules apply to them that don't apply to others. And hence they are paying more in electricity bills, they're paying more in other cost of living challenges as well, whether it's fuel, whether it's food, and so on. But they see very little action by governments to actually hold account big companies, energy producers, and deal with that. So yes, climate's down the list, but climate, and I say this within cost of living, for example, cost of living has different pillars, and it's got one pillar, it's health. Like last year, $700 odd million of Australian super funds went into paying for surgeries, right? 1 in 3 Australians are choosing not to have surgery because of that. It's actually 50% in regional Australia, and it's actually 60% amongst Gen X, amongst those people who are voting for One Nation now. Another pillar is housing. And again, cost of living is the roof. And I would put climate underneath that. It's all about how you frame it, right? Because what does climate do? Well, your insurance premiums go up if you live in regional Australia, flood-prone areas, bushfire-prone areas. You know one thing about your insurance premiums, they've been going up, and they've been going up exponentially because you are living in a high-risk area. If you're a farmer, you're experiencing drought, you're experiencing fires, stock loss. So there's ways of reframing it, but the pillars are all there. So as pollsters, we kind of do a mistake and we say, what's the most important issue to you? Really, we should be saying, what do you think is contributing to your anxiety and the stresses in your life? Younger people would tell us climate is up there, number 1, number 2, number 3, whatever that is. Regional communities will tell us it's there, but through different ways, like insurance premiums.
Yep. We've got a few questions coming through that are a variation on a theme again, which is around the any differences you can point us to between states in their views on these issues. In particular, because there is a view out there that some states have more influence in deciding these issues than others, and Western Australia is pointed to as an example of a place where they can influence policy in this domain quite significantly because of the mining sector and the resources sector in WA.
Yeah, that's right. So you could say that the Albanese government will be animated by the views of his Western Australian caucus colleagues, although urban politics is changing there as well. And so the federal seat of Tagny and federal seat of Moore unlikely to be animated by resource issues. There is a FIFO community that is quite significant in Perth, so that's a factor. There is that is a vulnerability, but that's a juggling game that the Labor Party has to actually perform, because sooner or later, the constituencies in Melbourne, Sydney in particular, who are demanding some action here when it comes to fairness, may end up punishing them in the ballot box.
Yep. We've got a question about the questions that you asked on the framing of pollution and the results, the strong results we see there. But it's pointed out to us that the pollution framing isn't necessarily new. This has been used for quite some time in the climate movement as an alternative to talking about emissions. Do you think there's something has changed so that pollution is cutting through more now and interacting with those fairness considerations?
The movement might use it, but I think from a communication perspective, it hasn't cut through. That's my point here, that I think it clearly, when we speak to Australians, they still will respond to emissions. They've heard that term used countless times. They've read it countless times. They've seen it in advertising, on TV, on online. But pollution has not been a consistent theme throughout, I would say, the last 10, 20 years. If it was, we will more than likely be having a very good discussion. So yes, it's been used, but it's not a universal term.
Excellent questions coming through. Keep them coming. Do you have any views, Kos, I guess, on whether the 2013 election was decided on these issues? Or I think there's some, probably a case of some truth to it, but also some folklore that's developed over time. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, 100%. I was there. So I can tell you. I can tell you. No, it was complete disunity and absolute. The one thing Australians hate a lot, back then the electoral roll was different, as I touched on in the presentation. 60% of the electoral roll was made up of baby boomers and older Australians back then. But Labor was projecting a very divided, self-obsessed brand, and was sending signals to the Australian public they weren't in the business of actually caring about the Australian public. And the end result is what we saw. People would say, "Oh, that was because of Tony Abbott's carbon tax campaign." Not really. It was really all about the disunity and complete lack of discipline within the Labor camp.
So just a follow-up, because I guess what do you think's caused the focus on this, or the resistance to looking at these issues again within the Labor Party and the broader climate movement? If the election wasn't decided on these issues, why do we see such strong aversion to it?
To your Western Australian example, there are electoral unknowns out there. How many seats do I lose if I double down on this policy in Western Australia? What could the resource sector do to my camp, to my ability to hold on to some of the seats that I gained in 2025 and 2022 in Western Australia? But flip side to that, if I was a strategist and I wanted to pursue that policy outcome, I would say, well, you've won Bennelong, you've won Reid, you've won Menzies, Deakin, you've comfortably re-elected your MPs in Chisholm and all these inner urban, middle urban electorates who are animated by this issue, particularly now that we are dealing with constituencies that are now dominated by millennial Gen Z. That's a balancing game they have to make in terms of what risks they take on, what risks they don't take on. Western Australia, and going to this point, Western Australia's politics were far more important than the Albanese government leading to 2025. Holding on to those Western Australian seats was very, very important because they were a minority government. Polling was rough. A lot of their vote was sitting in the other column. Now, by the way, that vote that was sitting in the other column wasn't thinking of voting Dutton. They were there because they have very similar views to what I was articulating in the presentation. The system stacked against me. The Labor, which I've supported for years, seems to not be in the business of addressing the issues that concern me. So during their campaign, they doubled down on one thing that clearly concerned this constituency, which was health. Right? And that probably some will argue they didn't go far enough, but there is still risk within the electorate that if you're seen not to be doing enough in climate, that eventually just adds, as it's another layer of many other layers of things that they've got gripes about, that you start losing votes. And in their case, they'll start losing votes to the Greens again. So the Greens had a bad day in 2025. I wouldn't rule them out having a good day next time round.
Because in these results, we know that, again, back to that ordering of issues that you asked about, cost of living, no surprise, rated very highly, off the charts. We know also that carbon pricing previously has been presented as a threat to cost of living. Your energy bills are going to go up, your lamb roast is going to cost $100. Can you talk about whether that's a vulnerability here, given the heightened sensitivity around cost of living? Is that something that we can expect a campaign on?
Yes, there would be. Look, if I was sitting on the other side and I had to build a campaign against it, I would say that, well, these additional costs will add to your bill. Now, the flip side to that is that if I was sitting on the other side, countering that, I'll say, well, they're shipping so much gas overseas. What's going on here? So that's, I think we could see a situation where both camps run their campaigns and you end up with a sentiment that, well, something needs to be done because clearly my bills are going up. When we ask, by the way, Australians, why is your electricity prices or your energy prices going up? They instinctively go to blaming the energy retailers. They don't blame governments. They don't blame anyone else. They just blame they're milking me. I'm paying more than I should. So but it is a challenging environment. You do have vulnerabilities. The geographic vulnerabilities, as we touched on, Western Australia, to a lesser extent in Queensland as well. And you do have the cost of living vulnerability as well. It all will come down to who runs the best campaign.
No doubt. We've got one from Wayne Smith here, Kos, who asks how important you think it is from a communications perspective to have bipartisan or a perception of bipartisanship on these issues, or is that overstated? It seems to me there's very few issues on which there's bipartisan common ground, but do you think that's important in this case?
One of the biggest issues that Australians have about our political system is the lack of bipartisan support for policy and reform in big issues that they are confronting as Australians, whether it's our economy, whether it's climate. They are really annoyed that all they see is a political fist fight over every single policy area. I think that, yes, bipartisan support does help, but the likelihood of that occurring in this political environment, I've got my doubts.
Because I guess we know that outer suburban seats in the major cities are really important in modern day elections. There's a question here about your research here, whether it focused on it, when you did the metro polling, did it focus particularly on inner city and regional divides, or did it also include outer suburban seats?
Yeah, we everything we do now, we will approach the entire country via a dozen different channels because we're so diverse. So yeah, outer suburban Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane is vastly different to inner Melbourne, inner Sydney, for example, or even inner Brisbane. You're going to get very little pushback on these sort of policy areas in the inner parts of our large cities. You're going to get an acknowledgement and there's something drastically needs to happen in the outer suburbs, but a fear that it might hurt them. Right? So yeah, I know this is it, but I've got these vultures called energy retail companies that are milking me at the moment. I've got 3 bills on my table that I can't pay. So that the mindset's different, but still they know something needs to be done, and that it actually feeds into their anger that they are forced to, have that contradiction themselves that they know something needs to be done in this space, but they are scared in supporting it because they may actually have to pay more in their electricity bills or the energy bills. Regional Australia, again, if you're in New South Wales coast, certain parts of New South Wales coast, you get very little pushback. But then if you go to Orange, you're going to get a different picture. So yes, there's we did that in the research. We're very careful, and it is mixed. But that slide where I had the levels of support, where they were all 80 plus, that's uniform everywhere.
As we know, there were some really interesting results in the polling around One Nation voters and their views on different topics. There's a question here about perhaps a tension there between what the One Nation voters are saying and the leadership of the party and perhaps even the supporters of the party who might be coming at this from a position of not wanting to tax resources or pollution more heavily. How do you see that tension playing out between the voters and the leadership of the party?
As a research team, it's exactly what we've been talking about. We're saying, at what point does she get herself caught in a vice? Because she has to be seen as anti-establishment, anti-corporate. And if she's tested in that space and she fails, that vote will start to go down. Because these people, there is an element, not all of the One Nation vote, but there is an element of that One Nation vote. I would say it's about a third, probably even higher, who will punish her if they see that she's just the same as the other mob. Now, I don't know what that will manifest. I don't know what that will look like electorally. We have no idea because we're not yet at territory, right, in many ways. But there is a very strong anti-establishment. You could see some of that playing out in Trump, for example, where he seems to be coming across as just taking care of certain elements of big business, and he's losing support amongst the mega crew because they are animated by this anti-establishment sentiment.
Mm. Taking a bit of a step back, Kos, in your experience, and I guess trying to draw analogies between what we're looking at here and other moments in history and different policies that have been successful in being implemented in the past. And we've seen, very strong support for polluter pays and for fair share in the polls that you presented. 68% support polluter pays and 87% support for fair share. What about translating that into action, into policy? What can we learn from history what does it take to translate strong polling numbers into action? We've seen the Albanese government make sort of slow and cautious reforms to date. What do you think it's going to take to make reforms like this that have strong public support, but perhaps are tricky politically?
Yeah, they will need to embrace reform across a number of challenging policy areas to convince a growing number of voters on their side of the political ledger that they are in the business of fixing the system. Because when we talk to a lot, even Labor voters, at least a third of them are very unhappy with the lack of reform in this space. So it's a tricky situation for them because, as we touched on, there are challenges for them with regards to some states, Western Australia being one of them. But it is a road they're going to have to cross, because if they don't cross that road and they do seem to be just walking around throwing band-aids around to some of the big challenges this country is facing, then we don't know what it looks like, but we now have a preview of what happens to a political party when it seems to be just interested in band-aids. Coalition is experiencing it right now.
We've got a number of questions that are focused on, again, that cost of living theme, Kos, and the campaigns that might be run against these policies. Can you reflect on what happened in 2013 and around that time? The Gillard government did have in place policies that tried to give back money to households and consumers with the carbon tax in place, but that seemed to not be very effective. In the current environment, we're likely to see a similar kind of campaign. How do you think that would play out differently, and what would be more effective at convincing the public that either their costs aren't going to go up or that they will be looked after by the government?
Unfortunately, it is actually proof in the pudding, because the level of distrust that the Australian public has about the political class's ability to deliver genuine positive outcomes for them through policies is very low. So it's one of these areas where you're going to have to deliver before people believe it. But they have a strong view that right now, as it stands, the political system is not set up to take care of them. Hence why they bite down pretty hard on, well, if you're earning millions and billions from our resources, you should give back to the community. It's a vulnerability that sooner or later that sector of our country will have to face, because I keep saying this to many other corporates around the country, that your social license footprint does matter. It absolutely matters in an absolute fragmenting political landscape. The only way you can inoculate yourself from bad decisions is get ahead of the curve, reinvest in the community, embrace people that are asking you to do it. So organisations who are running campaigns that you should, as an industry, do something different, you should sit at the table and talk to them, because that is the best way to inoculate yourself against what may happen in 5 years' time and 3 years' time, where our political landscape is so fragmented that the political class start jumping at shadows and making all sorts of crazy decisions, which will result in bad policy.
Obviously, it's a big news day for the coalition, or for the Liberal Party and their leadership. And you've spoken already about some of the demographic changes and other issues driving politics on the right. What do you think is a lesson from this research and your broader experience for the coalition as they seek to stem that flow of voters to One Nation?
Well, look, the absolute epicenter of the coalition's problem is they've lacked an economic offering to that constituency for quite some time. A lot of political commentators forget that they were in government for 9 years. During that 9-year period, these voters I've been speaking about will tell you their life went backwards. Their standard of livings went backwards. Their wages, have not been going up as they would like. They've accrued debt levels that they thought when they were in their 30s and 40s they could pay off. They're now in their 50s and 60s. And as I mentioned, they are working with their hands or standing on their feet. You in your 50s and you've got a massive mortgage, you're thinking, well, I'm running out of runway. And so the only solution for the coalition is to get into the economic space again and start offering some hope. But breaking through that cynicism, that's going to be pretty hard. It's going to be very hard. They are effectively experiencing what the Conservatives in the UK have experienced, and what the Republicans, the traditional Republicans, experienced before they were overtaken by Trump. And so this is a global movement. We're seeing that established centre-right political parties are being eaten up by populist right-wing movements. And supercharging those movements are working class conservatives.
Still on the coalition, Kos, there's a question here about the coalition's nuclear policy and its position on net zero. How do you see those things playing out in this environment? Both, what we're observing in the leadership dynamics of the party, the broader electoral trends, and the issues we're interested in today about policies that might be advocated for in this space.
Yeah, their policy on net zero obviously occurred before the problem they are now facing with One Nation. It was blooming, but it wasn't as significant as it is now. Back then, when they made that announcement, a lot of us made the point that, well, if you're in the business of trying to win back Wentworth, Kooyong, all these inner urban electorates that you lost to both Labor and the Teal independents, you've just given that up. And so you've also given up winning, because you cannot win federal elections. You cannot live in the lodge unless you are securing, as part of your electoral coalition, some seats which are not a minority but significant, who are very significant supporters of climate action. Yep. So this is the problem I think the coalition faces. We go back to that paradigm I talked about back in 2013. Back then, you could win an election without them. Now you can't. So now the climate-focused constituencies are far more powerful electorally than those who are not.
Yep. There's quite a few questions here about the fairness framing, and really interestingly, people can foresee the mining companies, the gas companies turning around the fairness construct to their own advantage. So they are big employers, particularly in certain parts of the country. They sponsor sporting teams and local sporting clubs. Yeah. They will say they pay a lot of tax already, and that's fair. How do you see those kinds of messages trying to tap into that fairness framing? Do you think they'll resonate if they come from the big end of town?
They will resonate in communities where they are investing. So if you look at some of these companies, they are investing in particular communities, but they will not resonate in big cities, because you speak to most urban Australians, they don't know. They don't see it. When you talk about sporting facilities, only for sporting facilities, if you're living in the big cities, is it something the government's paid for? So again, I'll go back to my initial point around what some companies have made, have thought that their social license agenda was suitable because they were investing in the communities in where they operate. That's great. That's sound. But you've got millions and millions of people who live in our big cities who don't know what you do. And you are vulnerable and open to all sorts of campaigns.
We're just about at time, Kos, but I think we have time for one more question, which we'd like you to perhaps finish on and take us through to the end on, which is, if you had a piece of advice for the current government in the context of all we've discussed today and the issues we're talking about, the dynamics in the electorate, the polling trends, what would your advice be for the Albanese government?
Embrace reform. If you want to be, as Albanese has stated, the party of government, and as in a party that wins more elections than loses them going forward, Yes, you can capitalise on an emerging constituency. This is the Gen Z millennial constituency I've touched on. You can win a lot of elections if you embrace reform. That reform has to be about tax reform, so taxing assets rather than income. It's obviously tax on other things as well that we've touched on. People want the ship righted. They want the system that they think is stacked against them recalibrated. That my advice to them will be, you need to get into that space. Okay, it's challenging, as we've talked about, challenging even in terms of this policy area. But if you don't go into that space, you're not going to be that party of natural government. Now, I don't know what that world will look like because we are fragmenting in all sorts of pieces at the moment. But yeah, people are not just going to reward treating water.